Welcome to the course, Culturally Responsive Built Environments. Today we'll talk about the second component of the power, how it is mediated in the built form, and especially in terms of spatial analysis, the know-how power mediates in built form. In fact, Dovey refers to one of the important model because on one side we are talking about subject of power which has the authority, the force, which is much more of a historical and the qualitative component of it, and then we are relating it to how we can relate to the how it actually influence the shaping the built form. And he actually talks about a space syntax model. And in fact, it refers to Hillier and Hanson's, where they talk about architectural discourse with its roots in representation technique has bypassed a deeper social structuring of architectural space because these structures are not visible. Like what we have just talked in Taksim Square caves, or so the history of the Ottoman and how the people have imagined it and how people have thought about it or understood about it. So these are all a qualitative subject, and in fact the way that is what they talk about. Hillier talks about the representation technique has bypassed the social structuring of architectural space. So this whole qualitative component, how it defines the architectural component, so that is where these socio and spatial structures are often referred as genotypes. And genotypes are basically a clusters of spatial segments structured in certain formations with syntactic rules of sequence and adjacency. So basically, when certain the understanding of a social structure and how it defines a particular architectural space, and that is what the relationship between the social and the spatial component, which is referred as a genotype. And there obviously from the Bourdieu's work also we talk about, or even the Martin Heidegger's work, we actually talk about certain rules, games and plays, where there are certain rules which are imposed. This is where the syntactic rules of sequence and adjacency. And genotypes are institutionally and epistemologically, which is epistemologically we talk about how the study of knowledge embedded. Thus, each built form is reproduced from a limited number of spatial genotypes. So you take about any particular building or a public place or anything, obviously it has certain background of certain inspiration, certain follow-up actions, or certain historical influence or mythological influences into it. So that is how a typology is reproduced from a limited number of spatial genotypes, and each linked to specific social institutions with forms of knowledge and productions. So whatever it might be from an authority point of view, it might be from a religious point of view, it might be from a social way of being point of view. They're all structured, and that is how it has been reproduced, but within a limited number of spatial genotypes. And that is what genotypes embody a social logic of a space. So I'll to much more simpler version, like when you talk about the word geno, obviously we are referring a kind of how it has roots with a kind of genetical influences. Like we have, if you look at me, obviously there are certain characteristics which comes from through your genetics. It could be the way your father's habits, habitual practices, the way your brother blinks an eye, so all these patterns are embedded within it. So how it actually gets into the structure. Now, what Dovey refers, he uses a systematic tool, which is a space syntax tool, analysis as a tool. Now, how one can, I can just give you a brief about how we can use this tool. In fact, Hiller and Hanson's are one of the who have promoted all these space syntax tools. And for instance, when you talk about how to compare these two plans, what you see here is both the different plans and how you actually look at it. So for instance, one can see that yes, there are some entry points, there is some courtyards, or there is some, so obviously you look at a size of a building or a size of interior spaces, and where the corridors are connected, how they are connected, are they open-ended, or is it a U-shaped corridor, or is it a closed loop, and how the corridors relate to the rooms, and the location of the entrances. Obviously, these are some of the important work, like you can see that how the entry points are defined, from which direction, and what kind of scale it is, the court is all about, and how within the corridor network, how the rooms are associated, right? So he proposes a kind of gamma analysis where it is a technique of mapping buildings into cellular structure using external entry points. For example, now we have about 4 types of buildings. Now you have the entry, and then in this case we have here, and right. So you can see that this is a kind of intermediate space. So it is bringing the connections of that, So that is how each model, the way it is connected, the way how we can map these in cellular forms, and then how we can actually connect all these things. And similarly, if you notice here, now in this form, you have 2 entrances, where 2 entrances, from there it goes on here, and then it goes here, and then it goes here, and goes here, right? So if you look at it from C, one is going to here, which is a court here, one is going to the E, and E is again connecting to the B, right? So that is how it's creating network. Whereas you look at this, 1, 2, 3, 4, and here, and so obviously it's a kind of linear way of organizing. Now, the basis of a space syntax gamma analysis is a study of the relation between the space and the other spaces within the plan. So whatever from the entry point as you take as a base, so basically there are 2 cells and 1 link. So these are the 2 cells and 1 link. So this is a basic structure in the gamma analysis. So now what are the various possibilities? Now, for example, in the same box, what you see here is there are 2 entrances, and you have the entry point, but you have, right, this is one what you get, and what is the other one? Like for instance here, if I close this, now you have 2, it's an independent loop, so obviously you can't connect this here, and which is a straight loop here, so which is a linear, right? So how it is connected from the exterior to the interior, it also gives the sight lines of how it connects. Now, and similarly, we talk about in the A, let's say from here we have a central courtyard, an entry courtyard, and all the rooms are within it. Whereas here you can see that there are 2 entrances within the interior court, right? And whereas the numerous entrances, this is very difficult to control. This model is basically it has freedom of movement. You go anywhere and come out of anywhere, and it has only 1 entrance, and how one can reach is one-way loop. Now, here what we noticed is in the first option, we have a controlled access, and within the controlled access, because there is a secure point, one enters into it and branches out, and that is how it is accessible. Whereas here it's a ringy, control to exterior connected onto the exterior. Whereas here it's open, permeable, ringy, but not controlled. So in the third option, there is no control over. So you can go anywhere around, whichever the way you like. And this is only a highly controlled, a linear pattern. Now, there are three kinds of relations between spaces. One is a linear, the connected, or maybe a networked, and a fan-shaped, which is a kind of, it bifurcates. In linear, it is also referred as enfilade. This is a kind of term which they use, a kind of linear processes, linear connections, and most of these historical and the dominant buildings, they're all mostly in a kind of linear way. Now, I would like to bring to when we talk about the space syntax and when we actually talk about power and how it's mediated within the built form, I think one of the famous personality which we should talk about is Adolf Hitler. How many of you know that in fact Hitler was twice rejected for architectural school. He has a great passion to study architecture and urbanism, and in fact there was some documents which he Dove refers with Hockman's work, and I will show those incompetent senile fools that I can go without them. So he's a great, so most of the time, even after he became the chancellor, he's given almost a day per week of looking into the architectural component of the administration. And another personality which we have to talk when we talk about Hitler is Albert Speer, who worked with Hitler as an architect, as a commissioned architect, and he has been involved in designing much of his work, much of the development of various chancellors' buildings and most of the urban context of those days. And Hitler, with his passion towards architecture and the way he's putting his ideologies in how he actually brings a fusion of this power within the built form, is where he talks about the community architecture as a product of collective effort to be used by and embody the spirit of a community. In fact, we are talking about the community architecture, so that is where he's talking about the representation. The representation on buildings and cities not only housed, but also represent this community. It could be a German community, it could be, and it is where he talks about the community, nation, and the race. So he's bringing that kind of language of representation. That is where and Hitler also talks about the theory of ruin value. So the ruin value, what he talks about is when we make buildings which should outlast the Reich or the Chancellor's building, believing that architecture had inspirational inertia which could carry a national spirit through periods of decline and retain its meaning in decay. So for instance, why these buildings has to be more, why we have to focus more on the architectural, because even in terms of decay or in a distress situations, at least these particular buildings can be of a national spirit, can actually motivate, So they also, that is what they say, the theory of ruin value. But obviously in a longer run, this particular concept of theory of ruin value in the modern times has been also criticized later. And Albert Speer, who has worked with him, and he has created many great buildings in Germany. And how the symbolism also makes a small contribution on Hitler's thinking, Like for instance, the Nazi symbol of the swastika, which is, he talks with the blood and soil, where he relates also with the connections of the Aryans so where is Hitler and where is Aryans? He also relates with the kind of indirect relationship with the kind of Aryan communities and the race. And he also taken this kind of swastika symbol, which is a kind of twisted cross of the German cross. Like it is basically a swastika. What it makes is it is a a kind of mandala, a potent mandala, which embodies both the stability of a square, if you look at it as the square, and the dynamic wheeling movement of the circle. So this was adapted to the Nazi context. It evoked the historic German cross but gave it a new turn. So this whole conceptualization taking from the Aryan civilizations and the mandala concepts. So where a swastika has an embodiment of a square, which is a stable part, and when it is embedded within the square, it shows a dynamic aspect of life. So that is where he talks about the symbol of creating and affecting life, how one can create and how it can actually symbolize the whole new movement. And Hitler's, with his great passion, he constructed his rural retreat at Obersalzberg in the Bavarian Alps, and it's almost about a 650 acres campus, and where he built buildings of which has actually built in a kind of terrain landscape, and in a vernacular style. He used the local stone and the timbers, and so if you look at the way it has been taken, so one who enters into the Germany, so maybe this gives a kind of signs that it has to pass through a kind of wide arch, and it takes you to the whole landscape. And so it's a kind of entrance to the kind of Germany, and most of the time he spent his time in this rural retreat. And now coming to the new Reitz chancellery, there was old Reichs chancellery where we call about the leaders, the administrative building, the chancellors. So in fact, this was old Reich chancellery, and you have the war bunkers and the Führer bunker, so this is a kind of thing, and this whole thing is actually the new development, and you can see, so, and there's a nice gardens over here. So how one can understand this particular patterns of how one can understand. So how Dove uses this is he narrates along with the narrations of, and again he narrates the whole description of these movements of the visitors, and how he analyzes this whole space using the space syntax tool that we will see in the next slide. So in fact, Speer describes that from Wilhelmsplatz, an arriving diplomat drove through great gates into the court of honor, which is the court of honor here. By way of an outside staircase, he first entered a medium-sized reception room from which double doors, almost 17 feet high, opened into a large hall clad in mosaic. He then ascended several steps, passed through a round room with dome ceiling, and saw before him a gallery of 480 feet long. And Hitler was particularly impressed by my gallery because it was twice as long as Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. So you see, here in the last point, he's actually comparing with the kind of why Hitler was impressed, because Hitler and Speer all went through about Paris. They are always taken a measurement of what Romans did, what the French did, and they are able to compare their visions accordingly, so to dwarf the existing Paris buildings, the Hall of Mirrors. So basically the moment they are expressing the scale of it, so in the other side you are actually dwarfing the existing monumental building. So that indicates the symbolic understanding of how to express the power. And like here, what you can see here is this is the gallery, the Mew marble gallery. I think what one will do is about they pass through the way the court of honors, and then the gallery, and then finally into the chancellor's component. And let's see, when someone is passing through this kind of the rich grand marble gallery, and to a very big scale, the huge scale of it, and viewing towards the gardens, that is giving a kind of pleasant environment. And one's journey is taking into the kind of from the kind of spaces they come into the courtyards and to pass through the gallery, and the artifacts of the eagles the symbolic eagles holding the earth. So obviously they're all talking about the power, in that way. Here, in fact, he talks about Hitler was delighted on the long walk from the entrance to the reception hall. They will get a taste of power and grandeur of German Reich. So that is where, so in fact, the whole from the court of honor, and it is reaching to a kind of vestibule, and it is created a rotunda, which is a circular dome sort of thing, and then they pass through this hall of marble, and then, but then when we analyze through the spatial analysis of in using the space syntax tools, so one can see that the diplomatic promenade from the entry to the court of honor, and then it has a diversion of this. You can see here the kind of chancellor's apartments, the portico, and the anteroom, the hall of mosaics, right? And this is where you can see the hall of mosaics, and this is how the rotunda and the ministers, and you can see the whole diplomatic promenade and the moment. So it is taking a whole set of journey of the whole German power and how the elegance, and how it is also giving an indication that it is dominant. Then the moment, if you look at, one has to understand this whole building component is, it has to be understood as a form of symbolic choreography, where the spatial structure operates to control the framing of series representational themes. Like here, what you see here is a long approach was a 10-segmented enfilade, like as we discussed in the space syntax forms of this enfilade of the linear patterns. And the deepest realm of the building is this, right? So which means, though they are visually connected, but still the physical connections, how they are taking them to these gardens and all other things, is the deepest realm of the building incorporated the formal reception hall and the cabinet room and some assistant offices. And at all, formal access to the inner realm was through the controlling segment of the hall of marble, right? So in that way, this whole analysis tool, you will actually get the site, the sight lines and the connection lines. But what the space syntax may not talk about is the kind of material it has used, or the kind of, the social component, which a textual or a narrative component of it. So this is an important thing, how you can actually relate with the kind of the social component along with the spatial component, so that we can get an association of how even the power hierarchies have been represented in the built form. Later in the years, you can see the photograph of the bomb-ravaged Reich's chancery. You can see this whole thing got demolished, and the gardens, and you have the court of honor, and then it's a series of this, going on the other way, and the way it is a huge doors, which itself marks the gigantic emblem, even the height of the doors, which actually signifies the kind of power and how rich they are, and also how because the moment you're putting an elegance instruments on the facade of the building, or very much at the entrance where the diplomats from many other countries are visiting your place, it gives some, some kind of prosperity, and it shows the regime of that particular chancellor. And then when we talk about Adolf Hitler's vision, and especially when he was talking about for Berlin, which we refer to Germania. In fact, this is a kind of photograph of a model of where Albert Speer was working secretly on this particular process. Earlier, if you look at the east-west axis, has been now dominant by the north-south axis, especially if you look at these proposals, which they talk about the huge dome. In fact, the dome was raised to more than the St. Peter's Dome, so in order to indicate a particular dominant structure, and then how this whole journey to the Vauxhall at the top of the, and then how how the journey actually takes a particular visitor shows the whole symbolic aspects of that power. And this have been his visions, and obviously there have been a lot of discussions on the Berlin War, the East Germany and the West Germany, and even today you can see that many of the remains of this Berlin Wall have been used with the graffitis, and some of them have been marked with some numbers where this many deaths have occurred during the crossover from East Germany, West Germany, and then so Berlin is always a contested place. It's one of the cities listed in the cities of conflict, including Nicosia, Beirut, and Belfast and Berlin. So here one can see that kind of contestation. On one side, how these powers. If you look at the Berlin Wall in this slide, you can see that it actually goes somewhere like this. Right, so that is how it mediates between the East Germany and the West Germany. So all these imaginations of what a power and how it is mediated through its dominance to its isolation. And a small barricade can also isolate a community. A small visual disruption also limits certain affections, or it can even limit certain communication of even a particular history or particular agency's understanding. So this is how a few examples of what we learned is basically the space syntax tools and how they are very much useful, and the gamma analysis of it, and how though despite of having a plan of this nature, but the moment you are keeping the connections intact and looking at the linear processes, and that is how it would be helpful to understand along with the narratives of the power structures and the stories and the myth and the text, how they actually relate with the spatial understanding. And again, I thank for Dove, who actually worked on this kind of holistic work on this framing places and mediating power with built form. Thank you very much.